welcome to Mail Story. If you enjoy stories, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next ones.
My friend kept hitting on my mother. I seduced his father. Me and Jordan had been best friends since middle school, and we were both 24 now, working at the same marketing firm downtown. My mom was 45 and had me young, but stayed in great shape doing yoga and Pilates. She'd been single since my dad died when I was 10, and seemed happy focusing on her nursing career and her garden. Jordan met my mom plenty of times over the years, and always acted normal until about 6 months ago, when he saw her at my birthday party. Mom had dressed up a little more than usual, and Jordan spent the whole night staring at her. After that, Jordan started finding excuses to come over when he knew Mom would be home. He'd suddenly need to borrow something right when she got back from her shifts at the hospital. He'd show up for dinner without invitation, and compliment everything Mom made even though she wasn't a great cook. He'd bring her flowers saying they were just sitting at his apartment dying. Mom thought he was being sweet, but I knew what was happening. The comments started getting weird. Jordan would tell Mom she looked too young to have a 24-year-old daughter. He'd say whoever dated her was the luckiest man alive. He'd mention how he preferred mature women who knew what they wanted. Mom would laugh politely and change the subject, but Jordan never got the hint. He started texting her directly after getting her number from my phone when I was in the bathroom. He sent good morning texts and asked about her day, and offered to fix things around her house. Mom showed me the messages, confused about why my friend was so friendly. I told Jordan to stop, and he said he was just being nice. He said Mom probably enjoyed having someone care about her day. He said I was being possessive and weird about my own mother. The escalation happened at Mom's birthday dinner. I'd organized a small gathering at a restaurant with family and a few of her friends from work. Jordan wasn't invited but showed up anyway with an expensive bottle of wine and a necklace that was definitely not appropriate for a friend's mom. He sat next to Mom and kept refilling her wine glass and touching her shoulder when he laughed. He made a toast about how Mom was the most beautiful woman he'd ever met, and how any man would be blessed to wake up next to her. My Uncle Carl actually choked on his food. Mom pulled me aside later and said Jordan was making her uncomfortable, but she didn't want to hurt his feelings since he was my friend. The next week, Jordan showed up at Mom's hospital with lunch saying he was in the area. Her coworkers thought it was sweet until he started showing up every few days. He'd wait by her car after her shifts. He'd text her about her schedule that he'd somehow figured out. Mom finally told him firmly to stop, but Jordan said she was misreading his intentions. He said he just cared about her as his best friend's mom. Then he told me Mom had been flirting with him and leading him on. He said she wore tight scrubs on purpose and smiled at him special. He said older women always played hard to get. That's when I decided to teach Jordan a lesson. Jordan's dad, William, was 50 and divorced from Jordan's mom for 5 years. He owned a construction company and had that silver fox thing going on from years of physical work. I'd met him plenty of times but never paid attention until now. I started stopping by William's company with coffee and pastries, saying I was in the neighborhood. I wore sundresses and laughed at all his stories about construction mishaps. I asked for tours of his job sites and complimented his work ethic. William was confused but pleased that his son's friend was so interested in construction. Within 2 weeks, I was texting William about restaurant recommendations and asking his advice about home repairs I didn't need. I sent him photos from the gym saying I was trying to get in shape and asking for workout tips. I showed up at his house with groceries saying I'd bought too much food for one person. William started inviting me to stay for dinner. He taught me to use power tools in his garage while I wore shorts that were probably too short. He took me to a classic car show because I'd mentioned loving old cars, which was a complete lie. Jordan found out when William mentioned our friendship at their monthly lunch. Jordan called me screaming that I was disgusting and inappropriate. I said I was just being nice to his dad, who probably enjoyed having someone care about his day. I said Jordan was being possessive and weird about his own father. Jordan showed up at my apartment demanding I stop seeing William. I told him I'd stop when he left Mom alone. He said that was different because Mom actually liked him. I pulled out my phone and played a voicemail from Mom asking me to make Jordan stop because he was scaring her. Jordan's mouth hung open while Mom's voice filled my apartment from the voicemail speaker. She sounded nothing like her usual calm self. Her words came out shaky and fast, asking me to please make Jordan stop because she didn't feel safe walking to her car after night shifts anymore. She described how he'd been waiting in the parking garage 3 times that week. The color drained from Jordan's face until he looked almost gray under my kitchen lights. His hands dropped to his sides and he stopped moving completely except for his chest rising and falling faster than normal. Mom's voice kept going, explaining how the hospital security guard had to walk her out twice, and how she'd started parking in different spots hoping Jordan wouldn't find her. When the voicemail ended, the silence felt thick and heavy between us. Jordan opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but no words came out at first. His earlier anger seemed to collapse inward, replaced by something that looked like shame, mixed with panic. He finally managed to speak, his voice much quieter than before. He started saying Mom must have misunderstood what he was doing there. I cut him off and asked him directly to explain what part of waiting by her car after dark in a parking garage could possibly be misunderstood as friendly behavior. Jordan's face went through several expressions, trying to find an answer that made sense. He couldn't. His mouth opened and closed twice before he just stopped trying. The defensive energy that brought him storming into my apartment had completely disappeared. He looked at my floor instead of at me. I waited for him to say something else, anything else, but he didn't. He turned and walked to my door without another word. His hand shook slightly when he grabbed the doorknob. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than if he'd slammed it. I stood in my kitchen after Jordan left, still holding my phone with the voicemail screen showing. The apartment felt too quiet. I'd won, technically. Jordan finally heard Mom's actual feelings instead of the fantasy version he'd created in his head. He finally understood he'd been scaring her, not romancing her. But the victory felt empty and cold in my chest. I sat down on my couch and stared at the wall. What I did to William kept pushing into my thoughts. Jordan had harassed my mom, yes, but William never did anything wrong to anyone. I used him like a tool to teach Jordan a lesson. I manipulated his feelings and made him think I cared about him when really I just wanted revenge. The satisfaction I'd expected to feel about confronting Jordan tasted bitter instead. 3 days passed without any contact from Jordan. At work, I started coming in 15 minutes earlier than usual and taking the back stairwell to my desk. Jordan must have changed his routine too because I never saw him in the hallways or break room. On the third day, I needed to grab a file from the printer near the main elevator bank. I timed it for when I knew Jordan would be in the morning meeting. Lorelei Winters from accounting caught me at the printer. She asked if everything was okay between Jordan and me with this concerned look on her face. I told her we were just dealing with some personal stuff. She nodded, but her eyes showed she wanted more information. She mentioned that everyone had noticed we weren't talking anymore and the office felt weird because of it. Her concern seemed genuine, but I could tell she was also curious about the gossip. My phone buzzed during lunch while I sat alone at my desk eating a sandwich. William's name appeared on the screen asking if I wanted to grab dinner that weekend. I stared at the message for 20 minutes. The sandwich got soggy while I tried to figure out what to say. I couldn't keep seeing William knowing what I'd done, but I also couldn't just stop responding to his texts without explaining anything after weeks of letting him believe we had something real developing between us. The right thing would be telling him the truth face to face. My stomach felt sick thinking about that conversation. I finally texted back suggesting coffee instead of dinner. He responded quickly saying coffee worked great and asked about Saturday afternoon. Saturday came too fast. I met William at a coffee shop downtown instead of the Italian restaurant he'd originally suggested. I picked that place because it was public and neutral, somewhere I couldn't avoid the conversation I needed to have. William walked in right on time carrying a small gift bag. His face lit up when he saw me sitting at the corner table. He looked genuinely happy, which made everything worse. He sat down and pushed the gift bag across the table before even ordering his coffee. Inside was a vintage carburetor from a 1967 Mustang that he'd found at an estate sale that morning. He remembered me saying I loved classic cars. Except I didn't love classic cars. I'd made that up to have something to talk to him about. I took a deep breath and told William I needed to be honest with him about something important. His smile faded a little, but he nodded and waited for me to continue. I explained everything as directly as I could. I told him I'd pursued him deliberately to get back at Jordan for harassing my mom. I told him my interest wasn't genuine from the start. I watched his face go through confusion first, like he was trying to understand what I meant. Then hurt showed in his eyes and the lines around his mouth. Finally, something cold and angry settled into his expression that made him look much older than 50. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He asked how much of it was fake. His voice came out flat and hard. I forced myself to be completely honest even though I wanted to make excuses. I admitted the attraction wasn't entirely manufactured, but my motivations were wrong from the beginning. I'd wanted to hurt Jordan by doing to him what he'd done to my mom. William's jaw tightened. He said I was just like Jordan, using people without thinking about their feelings at all. The comparison hit me harder than any other thing he could have said. I'd spent weeks being furious at Jordan for treating my mom like an object instead of a person. And then I'd turned around and done the exact same thing to William. I started to say something, but no words came out that would make any of this better. William stood up from the table without touching the gift bag he'd brought. He told me he hoped I learned something from this, but his tone suggested he doubted it. He walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. I sat there alone holding a car part for a hobby I didn't actually have. The weight of what I'd done to an innocent person pressed down on my chest. Other customers came and went around me. The barista came over after a while and asked if I was okay. I touched my face and realized tears were running down my cheeks. I hadn't even noticed I was crying. Mom called that evening while I was lying on my couch staring at the ceiling. She sounded lighter than she had in months. She told me Jordan hadn't contacted her in 4 days. No texts, no calls, no appearances at the hospital. She asked what happened when I confronted him. I told her about playing the voicemail and watching his face change when he heard how scared she actually was. Mom went quiet for a moment, then thanked me for protecting her. I wanted to tell her about William right then. I wanted to confess that I'd violated someone's trust and feelings just like Jordan had violated hers. But the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't admit my own boundary violations while we were discussing Jordan's. Mom deserved to feel safe and relieved without me dumping my guilt on her. I told her I loved her and we said goodnight. The morning after my talk with Mom, I sat at my desk staring at my email inbox. Jordan's name appeared in bold with a subject line that read, "Professional Boundaries Request." I clicked it open. The message was formal and cold, written like we were business associates instead of people who'd known each other since we were 12. He requested we limit all communication to necessary work matters only. He suggested we use email for project updates instead of talking in person. He asked that we schedule any required meetings with other team members present. The corporate language felt wrong coming from someone who used to text me dumb memes at 2 in the morning. I read through it 3 times, each pass making my chest feel heavier. This was really happening. 12 years of friendship reduced to professional courtesy and formal requests. I closed the email without responding because I didn't know what to say. Later that morning, I went to the break room for coffee. Lorelai from accounting was already there, stirring sugar into her cup. She looked up when I walked in and her expression shifted to concern. She asked if everything was okay between Jordan and me. I poured coffee and tried to act normal, asking why she thought something was wrong. Lorelai said the whole office could feel the tension between us. She mentioned that during yesterday's team meeting, the awkwardness was so thick people didn't know where to look. She asked if we needed HR mediation before it started affecting team dynamics and project deadlines. I realized our personal mess had become everyone's problem. Other people were uncomfortable because Jordan and I couldn't be in the same room without making the air feel heavy. I told Lorelai we'd had a falling out but were handling it professionally. She nodded but didn't look convinced. She said if we needed help working through it, HR had resources for that. After she left, I stood alone in the break room holding my coffee cup. I needed to get ahead of this before it got worse. I emailed Jasper Collier in HR and asked for a meeting that afternoon. Jasper's office was small and smelled like vanilla air freshener. He had one of those motivational posters on the wall about teamwork. He gestured for me to sit and asked what he could help with. I explained that Jordan and I had been close friends for years, but recently had a personal falling out that had nothing to do with work. I admitted the tension was probably noticeable, and I wanted to address it before it became a bigger issue. Jasper leaned back in his chair and asked if there were any harassment concerns or hostile work environment issues he needed to know about. I assured him it was just 2 former friends who needed space from each other. He asked if we could maintain professionalism despite the personal conflict. I said yes. We'd already established boundaries through email. Jasper made notes on his computer and said he appreciated me being proactive. He mentioned he'd probably reach out to Jordan as well to get his perspective. The next day, I received an email from Jasper that was also sent to Jordan. The subject line was, Workplace Professionalism Guidelines. Jasper wrote that he'd spoken with both of us about our personal situation and wanted to offer voluntary mediation services if we felt it would help establish clearer workplace boundaries. He attached a document about maintaining professional relationships and avoiding personal conflicts in team environments. He reminded us that our first responsibility was to our work and our colleagues who depended on our collaboration. The formal documentation made everything feel permanent and final. This wasn't just 2 friends fighting anymore. This was an HR case file with emails and guidelines and official acknowledgement that our relationship had broken down. I saved the email in a folder and tried to focus on my actual work. That weekend, Mom called and asked if I wanted to come over for dinner. Her voice sounded lighter than it had in months, almost cheerful. I drove to her house that evening and found her in the kitchen making pasta. She hugged me when I walked in, and I noticed she looked more relaxed. The tightness around her eyes had softened. Over dinner, she told me Jordan hadn't contacted her in over a week. No texts, no calls, no random appearances at the hospital. She said she'd been sleeping better and had stopped checking behind her car before getting in after her shifts. Small changes that showed how much stress she'd been carrying. I watched her twirl pasta on her fork and felt glad I'd done something to make her feel safe again, even if the method had been messy. Mom asked how things were going with me and I said work was fine. She set down her fork and studied my face. She mentioned she'd met William a few times over the years at the school events and neighborhood gatherings when Jordan and I were younger. She said he'd always seemed like a decent man, friendly and hardworking. The guilt must have shown on my face because she immediately asked what I wasn't telling her. Her nurse training made her good at reading people's expressions. I took a breath and told her everything. I explained how I deliberately pursued William to get back at Jordan. I described the coffee shop visits and the construction site tours and the classic car show. I admitted I'd manufactured interest in things I didn't care about to get his attention. I told her I'd used him as a tool for revenge without thinking about his feelings at all. Mom listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from surprise to understanding to something sad. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. She finally said she understood why I did it, but wished I'd found another way that didn't hurt someone who had nothing to do with the situation. She pointed out that I'd violated William's trust the same way Jordan had violated hers. The methods were different, and the motivations were different, but the core action was the same. I'd treated William like an object instead of a person with real feelings. The comparison made me defensive at first. I wanted to argue that it wasn't the same because I was protecting her, but I knew she was right. I'd done exactly what I'd been angry at Jordan for doing. Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said protecting people we love is important, but how we do it matters too. She reminded me that good intentions don't erase harm we cause to innocent people. I asked if she thought I should apologize to William again. Mom said an apology wouldn't undo the hurt, but it might help him feel less used and more respected as a person. She told me that taking responsibility for our mistakes is important even when those mistakes came from trying to protect someone. We finished dinner and cleaned up the kitchen together. Before I left, she hugged me again and said she was proud of me for being honest about what I'd done wrong. The next Monday at work felt worse than the previous week. Jordan and I both had assignments on the same client campaign, which meant we couldn't avoid interaction completely. During the morning team meeting, We sat on opposite sides of the conference table. Our manager reviewed project updates and assigned new tasks. When she asked for input, Jordan and I only spoke when directly addressed. We didn't make eye contact or acknowledge each other at all. The rest of the team noticed. People shifted in their seats and exchanged glances. Someone made an awkward joke to break the tension, but it only made things more uncomfortable. After the meeting ended, everyone left quickly like they couldn't wait to escape the weird atmosphere Jordan and I had created. Lorelai caught me at my desk right after everyone cleared out from the conference room. She perched on the edge of my workspace and asked if we could talk privately. We moved to an empty meeting room down the hall where she closed the door and turned to face me with her arms crossed. She said the tension between Jordan and me was making everyone uncomfortable during team meetings and affecting how the whole department functioned. People were picking up on the weird energy, and it was creating a negative atmosphere that made collaboration harder. She suggested Jordan and I either figure out how to work together normally or request reassignment to different projects, because the current situation wasn't fair to anyone else on the team. I told her I understood and would handle it. She squeezed my shoulder before leaving and said she wasn't trying to make things harder, but the team dynamic mattered too much to ignore. I sat at my computer that afternoon staring at a blank email to Jordan for 20 minutes before I started typing. I kept the message strictly professional and suggested we meet for coffee to discuss how to handle our work situation going forward. I read it 3 times to make sure nothing personal crept in before hitting send. Jordan responded 3 hours later with an equally formal message agreeing to meet at a coffee shop near the office the next day at 2. His tone was distant and businesslike, like he was scheduling a meeting with a client he didn't particularly like. The coffee shop was half empty when I arrived 5 minutes early. Jordan showed up exactly on time, and we sat across from each other at a small table near the window. We both ordered black coffee and didn't make small talk while we waited. When the drinks came, Jordan wrapped both hands around his cup but didn't drink. I started by saying we needed ground rules for work interaction, so we could both do our jobs without making everyone else miserable. Jordan nodded and suggested we keep all project updates via email instead of in-person conversations. I agreed and added that any necessary meetings should include other team members, so we're never alone together. He said no personal topics at all, and I said that was fine. We went through several more boundaries, like not commenting on each other's work unless directly asked, and keeping any feedback strictly professional. The whole conversation felt like strangers negotiating a business contract, rather than people who'd known each other since we were 12 years old. Jordan set his coffee down and said he'd been seeing a therapist for the past few weeks. He was working through his behavior toward my mom and trying to understand why he couldn't accept when someone wasn't interested. He didn't apologize directly, but he acknowledged he'd crossed serious boundaries and scared someone who never encouraged his attention. He said his therapist was helping him see how his thinking had become twisted and entitled. I listened without interrupting because I could tell this was hard for him to say out loud. I took a breath and told Jordan about what I did to William. I explained how I deliberately pursued his dad to get back at him and how none of my interest had been real. I wasn't trying to justify my actions, but I wanted to be honest about my own boundary violations in response to his. Jordan's eyes widened, and he leaned back in his chair looking genuinely surprised. He was quiet for a minute, then said we both messed up badly. He said he'd started it and his actions were worse because he'd targeted someone vulnerable and wouldn't stop when asked. But he said what I did hurt someone who had nothing to do with the situation, and that was its own kind of wrong. I agreed with him. We sat there for a while not saying anything and drinking our coffee. Jordan finally said he thought our friendship was probably over. I said I thought so too, but we could still maintain professional courtesy at work for both our careers. He agreed that made sense. The acknowledgement that 12 years of friendship had died because of this situation hung between us heavy and final. We finished our coffee and left separately without saying goodbye. Randolph Collier called me into his office 2 days later. He was Jasper's father and a senior partner at the firm who usually only dealt with major client issues. I sat across from his massive desk while he reviewed something on his computer screen. He finally looked up and said he'd heard about the tension between Jordan and me. He wanted to make sure it wouldn't impact the major client campaign we were both assigned to that launched in 6 weeks. The campaign was worth significant money to the firm, and he couldn't afford any personal drama derailing the project. I assured Randolph that Jordan and I had established professional boundaries, and the campaign wouldn't suffer from our personal issues. He nodded, but said he was considering reassigning one of us to a different project as a precaution anyway. The implication that our personal drama could derail a major account hit me hard. I realized how much professional damage this situation had caused beyond just the uncomfortable team meetings. Randolph said he'd make a decision by the end of the week and dismissed me. I walked back to my desk feeling like my career was evaluated based on personal mistakes. Jordan got reassigned to a different campaign 3 days later. I found out when I saw the updated project roster in my email. Later that afternoon, I overheard him talking to another coworker near the break room saying he'd requested the change himself. He said he thought it would be better for everyone if he moved to a different team. The relief of not having to work directly together anymore mixed with sadness that we'd reached a point where we couldn't be in the same room productively. 12 years of friendship reduced to avoiding each other in an office building. William's construction company got hired to do renovation work on our office building the following week. I saw him in the lobby talking to the building manager about the project timeline and materials. He was pointing at blueprints spread across a table and explaining something about load-bearing walls. I froze near the elevator bank hoping he wouldn't notice me. William looked up and our eyes met across the lobby. His expression went cold and hard in a way I'd never seen before. He deliberately turned away and continued his conversation with the building manager without any acknowledgement. I got in the elevator feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. The next day at work, I got into the elevator heading up to my floor when two construction workers in hard hats stepped in behind me. One of them was talking to the other about job site issues while I stood facing the doors trying to be invisible. The older guy with gray stubble said something about William seeming off lately, not his usual self when he checks on the crews. The younger worker asked if everything was okay with the boss, and the older one shrugged, saying William just seemed stressed and distracted, not making his usual jokes or asking about their families like he normally did. I felt my stomach twist as I realized my revenge plan had done more than just hurt William's feelings in the moment. I'd affected how he showed up at work every day, changed how he interacted with people who depended on him for their jobs and respected him as their boss. The elevator dinged at my floor, and I stepped out quickly before they could notice my face going red. Mom called me that evening while I was making dinner, her voice uncertain in a way that made me turn off the stove immediately. She said Jordan's mother had found her on Facebook and sent a long message apologizing for her son's behavior. The message apparently said she'd heard about what Jordan had done and was horrified that he'd harassed someone that way. Jordan's mom said she hoped they could still be friendly, despite what happened since they'd known each other for years through me and Jordan's friendship. Mom sounded torn as she read parts of the message to me over the phone. She said the apology seemed genuine and she appreciated someone in Jordan's family acknowledging how scary his behavior had been. But she also felt weird about staying connected to Jordan's family in any way after everything that happened. The whole situation made her uncomfortable, even though Jordan's mom had been nothing but kind in the message. I told Mom to do whatever felt right for her own comfort and peace of mind. I said she shouldn't worry about my feelings about Jordan's family, or try to maintain relationships that made her uncomfortable just to be polite. Mom was quiet for a minute before saying she thought she'd accept the apology and thank Jordan's mom for reaching out, but that she'd keep her distance and not try to maintain any regular contact. The boundary felt healthy and appropriate given everything that had happened. I agreed, and we moved on to talking about her garden and the tomatoes that were finally starting to ripen. Lorelai caught me in the hallway outside the conference room 2 days later and asked if I wanted to grab lunch. She had that look on her face that meant she wanted to talk about something specific, not just casual coworker chat. We ended up at a sandwich place down the block where she waited until we'd ordered before saying she'd heard rumors about what happened between Jordan and me. The office gossip had apparently filled in details that were both accurate and completely made up, creating a story that was half truth and half wild speculation. Lorelai said she didn't believe most of what she'd heard, but she was curious about the real story if I felt like sharing. I appreciated that she asked directly instead of just believing whatever version was floating around the break room. I gave her a simple version that acknowledged we both made serious mistakes. I explained that Jordan had been harassing my mom and wouldn't stop when she asked him to. So I did something equally wrong to make him understand how it felt. I didn't go into specifics about William, but I made it clear that I'd crossed lines I shouldn't have crossed, even though my goal was protecting my mom. Lorelai listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful as she ate her turkey sandwich. Her response surprised me. She said it sounded like two people who cared about protecting someone made bad choices under stress. She pointed out that human situations are messy and don't fit into simple good guy versus bad guy stories like people want them to. Lorelai said we both probably wished we'd handled things differently, but that didn't make either of us monsters, just people who made mistakes when emotions ran high. Her perspective helped me see the situation with less harsh judgment of myself, while still accepting that what I did was wrong. I thanked her for not treating me like I was either completely innocent or completely terrible, and she smiled and said, "Real life doesn't work that way." Lorelai mentioned that her husband Manfred works in construction and apparently knows William professionally. She said Manfred had mentioned recently that William seemed to be doing okay, but had been hurt by someone he was dating. Lorelai didn't know I was that someone, and I didn't tell her, just nodded and changed the subject. The guilt hit fresh, knowing that William's hurt was visible enough that his professional contacts noticed and talked about it. 3 weeks later, the campaign I'd been leading finally launched across all our clients' platforms. The client loved the creative direction, and the initial response numbers were strong, showing good engagement across their target demographics. Randolph called me into his office to congratulate me on the successful launch. He said he was pleased with how the campaign turned out and mentioned he was glad the personnel situation between Jordan and me hadn't impacted the work quality. I thanked him and said we'd both stayed professional despite our personal issues. The small professional victory felt good amid all the personal wreckage, like at least one part of my life was functioning properly. I heard through coworkers that Jordan's reassigned campaign had also gone well. People said he'd been more focused and productive since moving to the new project, really diving into the work with fresh energy. The physical and professional distance seemed to be helping both of us function better at work. We could each do our jobs without the constant tension of working directly together, and our teams were happier not being caught in the middle of our personal drama. I had a client dinner at an upscale Italian place downtown about a month after everything fell apart. I was waiting in the lobby for my client to arrive when I spotted William across the restaurant talking to someone at a corner table. My first instinct was to leave immediately, but my client texted saying she was parking so I couldn't bail without looking unprofessional. William glanced up and our eyes met across the room. This time he didn't look away immediately or go cold like he had in the office lobby. Instead, he gave a brief nod in acknowledgement before returning to his conversation. The gesture was definitely cold but not actively hostile, more like he was processing what happened rather than staying in active anger. I nodded back and turned away as my client walked through the door. Mom called me excited a few days later saying she had news. She'd started dating someone she met at a hospital fundraiser the previous month. His name was James, and he was a radiologist who worked at a different hospital across town. Mom described him as kind and respectful, someone who made her laugh and didn't push her boundaries or make her uncomfortable. She said he'd asked her properly on dates and respected when she said she wanted to take things slow. Hearing the happiness in her voice and knowing she felt safe and comfortable with someone appropriate reminded me that protecting her from Jordan's harassment had been the right goal. My methods were wrong and I hurt people along the way, but Mom being happy and safe with someone who treated her well was what mattered in the end. 3 months passed with Jordan and me staying in our separate corners of the office, and then my phone buzzed with a text from him on a Saturday morning. I stared at his name on my screen for a full minute before opening the message. He said he wanted to thank me for playing that voicemail. That hearing Mom's scared voice forced him to face what he'd been doing. He explained that therapy was helping him understand why he felt like he deserved my mom's attention just because he wanted it. He said his therapist called it entitlement and toxic thinking, and he was working through patterns he'd developed over years without realizing how wrong they were. The text was long and detailed, nothing like the brief work emails we'd exchanged for months. I read it 3 times before responding. I typed out several versions of my reply, deleting and rewriting until I settled on something honest. I thanked him for getting help and said we both needed to face hard truths about our actions. I admitted that using William was wrong even though protecting Mom was right. The conversation stayed brief, just 2 texts each, and it didn't fix our friendship or make things comfortable again. But something shifted knowing Jordan was actually working on himself, instead of just avoiding the problem. Jasper stopped by my desk on Monday morning with his usual friendly smile, and asked if he could grab a quick word. We walked to an empty conference room, and he asked how things were going with Jordan now that several months had passed. I told him honestly that the professional boundaries were holding strong, and the tension had decreased a lot. We kept our interactions to necessary work communication and stayed out of each other's way otherwise. Jasper looked relieved when I said that, mentioning he was glad the situation worked itself out, without needing formal steps or anyone getting written up. He said HR had been monitoring things from a distance to make sure the work environment stayed healthy for everyone. I appreciated that he'd checked in without making it a big official thing, just genuinely wanting to know we were both okay. I bought nice paper and a good pen from the stationery store, the kind with weight and texture that felt important. Sitting at my kitchen table that evening, I wrote William a letter apologizing for everything I'd done. I took full responsibility for using him as a tool to get back at Jordan without thinking about his feelings or treating him like an actual person. The words came slowly because I kept stopping to make sure they were genuine and not just making myself feel better. I wrote about how wrong I was to manipulate him and how he deserved so much better than what I did. When I finished, I folded the letter and put it in an envelope, but I didn't address it right away. The letter sat on my counter for a week while I read it every morning, checking that my apology was real and not self-serving. I wanted to make sure I was doing this for William, not for my own guilt. I finally wrote William's address on the envelope and dropped it in the mailbox outside the post office. My hands shook a little as I let it go, knowing I had no right to expect anything back. 2 weeks went by with nothing, and I told myself that was okay, that William didn't owe me forgiveness or even acknowledgement. Then a small envelope showed up in my mailbox with William's return address. Inside was a brief note on plain paper saying he accepted my apology and hoped I learned something about treating people with respect. The note was short and not warm, but it was more than I deserved. I kept it in my desk drawer and looked at it sometimes when I needed to remember that owning your mistakes matters even when you can't undo the damage. Mom called me excited on a Thursday evening saying she wanted me to meet James properly over dinner at her place. I'd heard about him for months now. The radiologist she met at the hospital fundraiser who made her laugh and never pushed her boundaries. Driving to Mom's house that Saturday, I felt nervous about meeting the man who'd become so important to her. James arrived right on time with flowers for Mom and a bottle of wine, greeting me with a friendly handshake and easy conversation. During dinner, I watched how he asked Mom about her day at the hospital, without interrogating her about her schedule or who she talked to. He complimented the meal she'd made without weird comments about her body or age. When Mom got up to grab dessert from the kitchen, James didn't watch her walk away or make any inappropriate remarks. He just asked me about my work at the marketing firm with genuine interest. The difference between James and Jordan hit me hard as I watched them interact throughout the evening. Jordan's attention toward Mom had always been about what he wanted, his fantasy of dating an older woman, his ego needing her to validate him. James actually cared about Mom as a person, asked questions because he wanted to know her better, respected when she said she was tired and ready to end the evening. Jordan had made everything about himself and his desires while pretending it was romance. James made everything about Mom's comfort and happiness without needing credit for being decent. The contrast showed me that my protective instincts about Jordan had been right, even though my response was completely wrong. Mom deserved someone like James who treated her well naturally, instead of someone like Jordan who felt entitled to her attention. The marketing firm sent out an email announcement about a major company reorganization happening over the next month. Jordan and I both ended up assigned to completely different teams under different managers, which meant we'd have zero professional overlap anymore. My new team focused on digital strategy for tech clients, while Jordan's new team handled traditional media for retail accounts. We wouldn't share meetings or projects or even the same floor of the building since his team was moving to the third floor. The physical separation made the office feel lighter somehow, like a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying finally lifted. Other people on my old team seemed more relaxed too, no longer caught in the middle of whatever tension existed between Jordan and me. Lorelai invited me to lunch at the sandwich place across the street, and halfway through her turkey club, she mentioned that office morale had improved lately. She said several people had commented on how the team atmosphere felt more positive, now that the weird tension between Jordan and me had faded into the background. I realized our personal drama had affected way more people than just us, creating stress and awkwardness for everyone who had to work around it. Co-workers had been walking on eggshells, trying not to mention one of us to the other, avoiding putting us in the same meetings, dealing with the uncomfortable silences when we ended up in the break room together. The reorganization hadn't just separated Jordan and me, it had freed everyone else from having to navigate our mess. I volunteered at a community charity build on a Saturday morning, showing up with work gloves and old clothes ready to help construct a playground. Williams Construction Company was the main sponsor, their logo on banners around the site and their crew leading the volunteer teams. I spotted William across the lot laughing with his foreman and a group of workers, looking more relaxed than the last few times I'd seen him. He wore a company shirt and work boots, directing volunteers to different stations with easy confidence. Relief washed over me seeing him smile and joke around, moving past what I'd done enough to enjoy his work again. He didn't notice me in the crowd of volunteers, and I didn't try to get his attention. I just hammered nails into playground equipment and felt genuinely glad that William seemed okay. William noticed me from across the event space and started walking over, which caught me completely off guard. I'd been holding a hammer pretending to look busy with a section of fence, but my hands froze when I saw him approaching. He smiled slightly when he reached me, the kind of polite smile you'd give a distant acquaintance rather than someone who hurt you. He asked how I was doing, and I managed to say I was okay, my voice coming out shakier than I wanted. William said he was doing well too. Better than he expected, actually. He'd been thinking about everything that happened and decided to view the whole experience as a lesson about being more careful with his trust rather than letting it make him bitter. The grace in his words made my chest tight because I knew I didn't deserve that kind of response after what I'd done to him. He could have stayed angry or cold, but instead he'd chosen to process the hurt and move forward without carrying resentment around. I thanked him for handling everything with so much understanding and admitted I didn't deserve his kindness after deliberately using him as revenge against Jordan. William looked at me for a moment before saying, "People make mistakes when they're under stress, and what really matters is learning from those mistakes." He said he hoped I'd learned something from the whole situation, then wished me well before turning back toward his crew. I watched him walk away, feeling lighter somehow, like his forgiveness lifted a weight I'd been carrying for months even though I hadn't asked for it. The marketing firm held a company happy hour at a bar downtown 3 months later, and I walked in to find Jordan already there talking to people from his new team. My first instinct was to leave, but Lorelai spotted me and waved me over to her group near the bar. Jordan glanced up when I approached, and we made eye contact for the first time since the reorganization separated our teams completely. He nodded at me, and I nodded back, a simple acknowledgement that we existed in the same space. Lorelai started talking about a difficult client, and Jordan added a comment about dealing with similar issues on his team. I mentioned a strategy we'd used successfully on my project, and Jordan said that was a smart approach. The conversation stayed completely surface level, focused entirely on work topics, without any personal details or references to our shared history. We talked like colleagues who'd never been close, maintaining polite distance while discussing marketing campaigns and client management. After about 10 minutes, Jordan excused himself to talk to someone else, and I felt relieved rather than sad. The interaction proved we could be in the same room and function professionally without drama or tension. We'd never be best friends again, but we'd figured out how to exist in the same professional world without making everyone around us uncomfortable. Mom called me on a Tuesday evening sounding happier than I'd heard her in years. She said she had news and asked if I could come over for dinner that weekend. I knew from her voice what she was going to tell me, but I played along and said I'd be there Saturday. When I arrived, she was practically glowing, and James stood next to her with his arm around her waist, looking equally happy. Mom held up her left hand, showing me the ring, and announced they were engaged after 8 months of dating. I hugged her tight and felt genuine joy for the first time in months, seeing how completely happy and safe she felt with James. She deserved someone who treated her with real respect and love, instead of someone who felt entitled to her attention like Jordan had. James had never pushed boundaries or made her uncomfortable. He'd never shown up uninvited or sent inappropriate messages. He'd simply been kind and patient, and let their relationship develop naturally at Mom's pace. The contrast between James and Jordan showed me that my protective instincts about Jordan had been completely right, even though my response method was totally wrong. Mom talked about wedding plans and venue options while I sat at her kitchen table feeling like everything had been worth it, despite the messy path we'd taken to get here. Mom asked me to be a bridesmaid 2 weeks later when we met for coffee near the hospital. She said she was keeping the wedding small with only close family and friends, maybe 40 people total at a garden venue she'd found outside the city. I said yes immediately and asked about the guest list. Mom ran through names of relatives and her coworkers from the hospital and James's family members. The absence of Jordan from her life was obvious, but neither of us mentioned him directly. He simply wasn't part of our world anymore, removed completely from Mom's circle after months of harassment that had finally ended. Mom seemed lighter, without his constant attention and boundary violations. She didn't check her car before getting in anymore, or worry about unexpected visitors showing up at the hospital. James had helped her feel safe again in ways that went beyond just being a good partner. His presence in her life had replaced the anxiety Jordan created with actual peace and security. The wedding took place on a Saturday in May with perfect weather and flowers everywhere in the garden venue. I stood next to Mom's other bridesmaids watching her marry James, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her happiness and well-being. My Uncle Carl was there with his wife. Mom's coworkers from the hospital sat in the second row. James's grown daughter stood on his side looking thrilled to have Mom joining their family. Everyone present wanted good things for Mom without any hidden agendas or inappropriate desires. I watched James look at Mom like she was the most important person in his world, which she was, and I felt complete peace about how everything had turned out. Jordan's harassment had ended. Mom had found real love with someone who respected her. The path to this moment had been incredibly messy, and I'd hurt people along the way. But the outcome standing in that garden watching Mom get married was undeniably positive. She was safe and happy and loved by someone worthy of her trust. Lorelai mentioned at lunch the following week that Jordan got promoted to lead a new division at the firm. Apparently, he'd been doing excellent work on his projects and building a reputation as a respectful team leader who people actually wanted to work with. The therapy and self-reflection he'd been doing seemed to have genuinely changed his approach to relationships and professional boundaries. I heard through other coworkers that his new team appreciated his management style and that he'd been getting positive feedback from clients. The promotion felt like proof that people could actually change their behavior patterns if they put in real work to understand why they'd acted badly in the first place. Jordan would never be my friend again, and I'd never forget what he did to Mom, but I could acknowledge that he'd taken responsibility and made real efforts to become a better person. I got promoted 3 weeks after Jordan, taking on a senior strategist role with more responsibility and creative control over major campaigns. Randolph called me into his office to offer the position and said my work over the past year had been consistently strong and showed real leadership potential. The promotion felt earned and completely separate from all the personal drama, a reminder that professional success could exist independently from relationship disasters. I'd worked hard on my campaigns and built good relationships with clients and team members. The new role came with a significant raise and my own small team to manage. Walking out of Randolph's office, I felt proud of myself for the first time in months, not because of anything related to Jordan or Mom or William, but because I'd actually done good work and gotten recognized for it. Manfred stopped by Lorelai's desk one afternoon while I was there discussing a project, and the conversation shifted to weekend plans. Manfred mentioned he'd run into William at an industry event, and that William seemed to be doing really well lately. Lorelai asked what William had been up to, and Manfred said he'd started dating someone seriously, a woman he met through his construction network who shared his interest in classic cars. I felt genuinely happy hearing that news, relieved that William had found someone real after I'd used him so badly. The woman probably actually cared about vintage automobiles instead of pretending for manipulation purposes. William deserved someone honest who wanted to be with him for legitimate reasons, rather than as a revenge tool against their friend. The guilt I'd been carrying about William eased slightly, knowing he'd moved past what I did and found something authentic. A full year after the confrontation with Jordan, I attended a professional marketing conference downtown, where both our firms had people presenting. I was scheduled to speak on a panel about digital strategy, while Jordan was presenting on a different panel about traditional media integration. We ran into each other in the convention center hallway between sessions and stopped to talk instead of just nodding and moving past each other. Jordan asked how my panel went, and I said it went well, then asked about his presentation. He said the audience seemed engaged, and he'd gotten some good questions afterward. We stood there talking about our work for several minutes, discussing industry trends and challenges we were facing with different client types. The conversation felt real for the first time since everything fell apart. Not forced or awkward, but genuinely professional. Jordan mentioned he'd been thinking about our situation lately and realized how much we'd both changed over the past year. I agreed that we were both different people now, shaped by the mistakes we'd made and the work we'd done to understand those mistakes. We acknowledged that our friendship wouldn't be what it was before, but that we'd both grown from the complete disaster in ways that made us better at our jobs and better at respecting other people's boundaries. Jordan mentioned something about his girlfriend then, describing how they met through a board game meetup and discovered they both loved hiking and terrible horror movies. He explained that his therapist helped him see how he kept chasing women who couldn't or wouldn't want him because it protected him from actual vulnerability. If someone was unavailable, he never had to risk real rejection or intimacy. The pattern made sense once he said it out loud, and I could see how Mom fit perfectly into that framework. She was older, his friend's mother, completely off limits, which meant he could pursue her without ever facing the possibility of a real relationship with actual demands and expectations. His face looked different when he talked about his girlfriend, more relaxed and genuine, like he was describing someone he actually knew rather than someone he'd built up in his imagination. I told Jordan about my own therapy sessions, how my therapist kept asking why I thought manipulation was the appropriate response to someone I loved being hurt. We'd spent weeks unpacking my tendency to protect people through schemes and revenge instead of just communicating directly and setting clear boundaries. I admitted that seducing William was about control and punishment more than protecting Mom, that I'd used another person as a tool in my personal drama without considering his feelings or autonomy. Jordan nodded and said, we both treated people like objects in our stories rather than humans with their own lives and feelings. He'd objectified Mom as this fantasy figure who existed for his desires, and I'd objectified William as a revenge weapon who existed to teach Jordan a lesson. Neither of us had considered that these were real people with their own needs and boundaries, who deserved respect regardless of our personal situations. We stood there in the convention center hallway while people walked past us heading to different sessions, and Jordan said he didn't think our friendship could come back from what happened. I agreed, because too much damage had been done, too many boundaries crossed, too much hurt caused to too many people. But we both acknowledged that the wreckage had forced us to grow in ways we probably wouldn't have otherwise, to confront ugly patterns in ourselves that might have continued for years if this situation hadn't blown everything up. Jordan extended his hand for a handshake, formal and final, and told me he hoped my life turned out well. I shook his hand and said the same, meaning it genuinely despite everything. The 12 years of friendship were over, dead and buried under the weight of harassment and manipulation, and all the ways we'd both failed to be decent people. But at least we'd learned something from the destruction. Mom and James had their first anniversary party at their house, a small gathering in the backyard with string lights and a playlist James spent weeks perfecting. I watched Mom dance with her husband while her friends from the hospital cheered, and her book club members took photos. James held her close but not possessive, laughing when she stepped on his foot, kissing her forehead between songs. The contrast to Jordan's behavior couldn't have been sharper. This was what real care looked like, what genuine affection and respect felt like, what healthy love actually was when both people saw each other as full humans rather than objects or fantasies. The path to this moment had been messy and wrong in significant ways. I'd hurt an innocent person and violated someone's trust and used manipulation instead of honest communication. But Mom was safe now, genuinely happy with someone who cherished her. And I'd learned that protecting the people you love requires wisdom and restraint and direct action, not just fierce revenge or clever schemes. Sometimes the right way to help someone is simply to support them in setting their own boundaries, rather than taking matters into your own hands in ways that create new victims.